Hey, OC Bridges, it is Monday, July 6th, and this week marks Natural Disaster Week. We got to keep in mind that we got a lot of things that happen around the areas that we live in. Some major, some small. Here are a couple of small ones. This is the creation of a couple of small rumbling earthquakes that happen in California. So just keep that in mind. And also we got a lot of stuff that happens here, and thanks to all this vegetation, or as I would say, all these plants, we do not have any slopes falling when it rains. So yeah, here we go. I live in a nice little area, but I'm going to show you something pretty cool that's in my backyard. Now my wife and I tend to walk around this back end of the trail over here because we really love the nature that we see in the background. There's also a little creek over there right below. So we've got a lot of things that we look around, and we've got a lot of things that we see from time to time. Sometimes we see a couple of squirrels, coyotes that we can see far off in the distance on the other side of the creek. And we also do have a couple of pumpkins that we can see over here being planted from time to time. So yeah, now I'm reaching the other side right over here to the entrance of the trail. Here we go. Now, out of an abundance of caution, I like to make sure that there are no rattlesnakes on each side. It's just the general rule that we should all look for anything that could be dangerous. But thankfully, this trail's pretty safe most of the time. Now, this trail leads off into that area, which leads all the way to a 7-Eleven, then a couple of trails down there, right by some horse sheds. But over here is where I'd like to show you some of the cool stuff. Now, as I mentioned before, a couple of pumpkins tend to come out from here. So it's nice to look at the progress of these pumpkins from time to time. Summer. Ooh, like you see right over here? Got some big fire ants that we gotta keep an eye out for. That is a nice small little ant hill. There's a couple of ants over here, so I'm gonna go around it. Now, as I mentioned before, we got earthquakes, big and small, around here. And this one isn't a huge one, but it's big enough to warrant these orange borders here. Now, if you look closely over there, we had that little trench that was created. I'd pass through, but it's really not safe to pass. But yeah, that right there is one of the natural processes that occurs from earthquakes over here. Now, in order to understand earthquakes, you have to understand fault lines, and I'm going to go over that right now. Essentially, what a fault line is two different slates of the Earth's crust that go against each other. There are different kinds of fault lines. There are, I think, 3, so I'll go over those later. Now I'm going to head back home and relax, and I'm going to show you some of the fault lines that are created through earthquakes. Now, a normal fault is a dip-slip fault in which the block above the fault has moved downwards while the other one has moved upward. Essentially, if you were on a road, one part of the road would go down and the other one would go slightly up, and that's essentially what a normal fault is. That is what happens with the creation of some of the cliffs, so keep that in mind when you look at some of the cliffs that you see around the ocean or wherever you go, okay? Now, thankfully, we don't have a huge one around our area. Like this, we have the thrust fault, which is also seen in the ocean and also seen in one big area that we've all talked about at some point in our lives. Now, the thrust faults are also responsible for 3 things. They're responsible for 1, the creation of mountains, like you see in India and China. That's what you saw with Mount Everest and why they're so tall. You've got one fault line on top of the other fault line, and it creates a mountain, and it juts some of the land all the way up there. That's why you see the highest point over there with some of the mountains. We've got Annapurna, we got K2, Mount Everest, and a bunch of other different kinds of mountains. Now over here we've got Mount Everest right over here being pointed out. Now it doesn't look so high because we're getting the perspective of this one right over here. I believe that should be Annapurna. Now Annapurna is actually one of the most dangerous mountains to climb. Out of the top 10 highest mountains in the world, I think Mount Everest is one of the easiest to climb. So nice little fun fact right there. And it also has to do with the formation of the mountains. Like as you see right over here, this would be easier to climb, but you see how this right over here is really high and steep. That's what makes that one so hard to climb. So nice little fun fact. Now the other subduction zone that we've got is also between the crust over here in the Pacific Ocean. We got some fault lines that go under one another. And some of the water that you see going down there is what is responsible for creating the volcano. The water tends to accumulate down there when it reaches all the way to the bottom right over here of the fault line, and that water holds some bacteria. And eventually, all that water connects with some of the magma down there, and thus it creates a volcano eruption. And this happens over a long period of time, so more to show you a little later, okay guys? Now here's an example of how the volcanoes are formed. You see the oceanic crust that's going down there? You got to keep in mind that some of the water and the bacteria that goes down there accumulates over time, and this creates a nice little process. And all these plumes go all the way up, thus creating the volcanoes that erupt. Now these volcanoes are responsible for a lot of the islands that we see out in the ocean and a lot of the processes that we see formed all over the world. It can be scary, but they can also be very beautiful to watch depending on which kind of volcano it is. So there you go. And just be aware, they are going over it with Zoom, so who knows, they might be already talking about it. Now this one is one of the most popular in California. We've got the Strike Slip Fault, which is responsible for the San Andreas Fault. Now the way the San Andreas Fault works with the Strike Slip Fault is essentially we have two fault lines that just go past one another. That's all it does. They can be really strong or they can be really weak. And there you have it, guys. Hope you enjoyed my video, but just be aware. We tend to have a lot of earthquakes around here, but they tend to be pretty small. You probably have 1 or 2 a day at least around this area, so don't be too frightened, but also be aware, okay?